In 1980, a man who had never fired a pistol in his life decided to enter the most competitive firearms market on Earth. He had no gun industry experience, no military background, no connections in the defense world. His company made curtain rods. 4 years later, he walked into the United States with a pistol made largely of plastic and told American gun makers, companies with combined centuries of experience, government contracts, and institutional relationships, that he was going to take their market. They laughed at him. They shouldn't have. Today, Gaston Glock's pistol is carried by 65% of American law enforcement. It is the best-selling handgun in the United States. It has been adopted by military and police forces in more than 50 countries. The American gun industry that dismissed him never fully recovered the ground it lost. This is the story of how a curtain rod maker from Vienna built the most successful pistol in history, and what it cost the American companies that never saw him coming. Gaston Glock was born in Vienna on July 19, 1929. His father was a railway worker. His family was working class, practical, and unconnected to anything resembling the weapons industry. He studied engineering, showed an aptitude for materials science and manufacturing, and built a small company in the town of Deutsch Wagram just outside Vienna. The company made things. Practical, unglamorous things. Curtain rods, field knives, entrenching tools for the Austrian military. Glock was good at understanding materials, particularly polymers, the synthetic plastics that were transforming manufacturing across industries in the post-war decades. He understood how to make things light, strong, and cheap to produce at scale. He was not, by any conventional measure, a person who should have been designing firearms. He had never worked at a gun company. He had never served in the military. He had no formal training in ballistics, no relationships with defense procurement officials, no background in the mechanics of automatic or semi-automatic weapons. What he had was an engineer's mind and a complete absence of preconceptions about how things had always been done. That combination, it turned out, was more dangerous to the established firearms industry than anything they had faced in decades. By 1980, the Austrian military was looking to replace its aging Walther P-38 service pistol. The P-38 had been the standard sidearm of the German Wehrmacht during World War II. A capable gun for its era. But by 1980, it was 30 years old and showing it. The Austrian army issued a formal request for a new service pistol. The established European manufacturers responded as expected. Heckler & Koch submitted a design, Steyr submitted a design, several Italian and Swiss manufacturers expressed interest. These were serious companies with serious engineering teams and serious track records supplying military contracts across Europe. Glock heard about the contract through contacts in the Austrian Defense Ministry. He had no design to submit. He had no pistol at all. What he had was curiosity and the kind of systematic approach to problem-solving that comes from spending a career figuring out how to make things better than they currently were. He started by doing something remarkably simple that the established manufacturers had largely stopped doing. He asked the people who would actually use the gun what they needed. He interviewed Austrian military officers. He talked to special forces personnel. He asked police officers. He visited shooting ranges and watched how people actually handled pistols under stress. Not how instructors said they should handle them, but how they actually did when tired, under pressure, in difficult conditions. He cataloged every complaint about every existing service pistol he could find. The picture that emerged was consistent. Military and law enforcement users wanted more rounds. They wanted lighter weight. They wanted fewer parts that could fail in the field. They wanted a safety system that worked automatically rather than requiring a manual step that could be forgotten under stress. And they wanted a gun that could be maintained by a soldier with basic tools, not a trained armorer with a full workshop. Nobody had built that gun yet. Glock decided he would. The design process took roughly 6 months. Glock worked with a small team and consulted with firearms experts who helped ensure the mechanical fundamentals were sound. What emerged was unlike anything the established industry had produced. The frame was polymer, the same class of synthetic materials Glock had been working with for years in his manufacturing business. This was not a compromise or a cost-cutting measure. Polymer was lighter than steel, resistant to corrosion, and capable of withstanding the mechanical stresses of a service pistol. The barrel and slide were steel. The frame was not. The result was a pistol that weighed significantly less than its steel-framed competitors, fully loaded. The magazine held 17 rounds of 9mm ammunition. Every competing service pistol of the era held fewer. The Glock 17, named for its 17-round magazine capacity, not some arbitrary product designation, gave its user nearly 3 times the firepower of a standard 6-shot revolver without a reload. The safety system was built into the trigger itself. 3 independent passive safeties engaged automatically whenever the trigger was not being deliberately pulled. There was no external manual safety lever to disengage under stress. The gun would not fire accidentally, but when the trigger was pulled with intent, it fired immediately without any additional step. For military and law enforcement applications where fractions of a second and automatic muscle memory could be the difference between life and death, this was not a minor feature. It was a fundamental operational advantage. Total parts 34. The average competing service pistol of the era had significantly more complexity, more potential failure points, more components to maintain and replace. The Austrian military tested the Glock 17 against 17 competing designs from established manufacturers across Europe. The Glock 17 won. The contract was awarded in 1982 to a company that had never made a gun before. Word of the Austrian contract reached the United States, but the reaction from American manufacturers was largely dismissive. A plastic gun that had won a small European military contract was not, on its face, a serious threat to companies that supplied the FBI, the U.S. Army, and police departments in every major American city. The dismissal was compounded by a media controversy that, in retrospect, the American gun industry should have been more careful to avoid amplifying. In early 1986, a columnist named Jack Anderson published a piece claiming that the Glock's polymer construction made it invisible to airport metal detectors, essentially a terrorist's perfect weapon, available to anyone with a gun store near an airport. The claim was false. The Glock contained more than a pound of steel components that would trigger any standard metal detector without difficulty. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms tested the claim and confirmed it was baseless. But the story had legs. It was picked up by newspapers across the country, debated in Congress, and attached itself to the Glock brand in the American public consciousness for years. Here's the thing, it didn't matter, because Glock wasn't trying to sell to the American public yet. He was selling to American law enforcement. And law enforcement procurement officers were not reading newspaper columns. They were reading ballistic test results, maintenance cost analyses, and round count comparisons. On every metric that mattered to a police department making a purchasing decision, the Glock 17 was better. More rounds, lighter weight, lower maintenance cost, faster deployment, easier to train on, and at a price point that made the cost per unit comparison favorable against American competition. The Miami FBI shootout in April 1986, in which 2 agents were killed and 5 wounded in a confrontation where firepower and reload time proved decisive, sent a shockwave through American law enforcement. The argument for higher capacity semi-automatic pistols, which had been building for years, became impossible to ignore after Miami. Departments that had been debating the switch accelerated their timelines. Glock was ready. Smith & Wesson was not. By 1990, Glock had captured an estimated 35% of the American law enforcement market. By 1995, that figure was approaching 65%. The company that had made curtain rods in 1980 was now the dominant supplier to American police forces, a position it had taken directly from American manufacturers who had held it for generations. Smith & Wesson eventually developed competitive semi-automatic designs. Ruger entered the market. American manufacturers adapted. But the landscape Glock had created, high-capacity, polymer frame, striker-fired, low maintenance, became the new standard that everyone else was measured against. American companies were competing on Austrian terms, in a market that an Austrian had defined. Gaston Glock became extraordinarily wealthy. He survived a hammer attack by a hitman hired by his former business manager in a Luxembourg parking garage in 1999, a story that deserves its own video, and continued running his company into his 90s. He died in 2023 at the age of 94, still in control of the company he had built from nothing. The curtain rod factory in Deutsch Wagram that started it all is still there. The company that grew from it now generates over $1 billion in annual revenue, supplies military and police forces on every continent, and holds a position in the American market that Samuel Colt himself couldn't have imagined anyone taking from domestic manufacturers. Nobody saw him coming. That was always the point. If this story hit you, drop a comment below with what you carry and whether it's a Glock. I want to know. And if you want more stories about the outsiders, the underdogs, and the companies that rewrote the rules of American industry, subscribe and ring the bell.